So the history YouTuber Tick made a video about capitalism and socialism called Tick's Definitions Are Wrong. And I already did a response video to this on together with Owning Dishonest Shills. Right, here's the response video we did together, where we basically refuted all of his silly points because he actually uses wrong definitions of capitalism and socialism. Basically, he defines every type of dictatorship as socialism, and he even thinks that owning shares, right, private individuals owning shares in a company somehow equates with worker ownership of the means of production, which would be socialism, according to him, right? So what I actually want to do now is I've gone to his comment section and I want to respond to a comment that he made to highlight how economically ignorant he actually is, right? And to once and for all refute his nonsense on capitalism and socialism, because he has no idea what these things actually are, right? And in what kind of economic system we actually live, right? Because he seems to think that we kind of live in socialism. That's at least the impression that that I get from his videos, right? But we do actually live in capitalism, right? So let me read you some comment that someone made under his video and then his response, and then we'll debunk Tick's response. So the user Marxist Dialectic Forum writes, "You do realize that there is this thing called global wealth inequality, and that 1% of the population of the planet owns more than the bottom 90% of the population combined, right? What do you think the 1% of the global population owns, Tick? All the shares. They own like 95% of all the shares traded in the global stock markets. A good example, 8 people now own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population of Earth. Those 8 people own shares, a lot of shares. I do agree that governments prop up the corporations. Why? Because the billionaires own most of the governments too. They always have. Tick. Capitalism is an economic system built around the capitalists, the robber barons, the captains of industry, etc. This is their system, not ours. You want individual empowerment, you want normal people to have all the power. Well, how do you plan to do that, Tick? Now, this is a pretty reasonable comment under Tick's video. Now, let us now read his response, right? Now, Tick writes, quote, "We have more socialist policies than ever before in the West, yet the rich are getting richer. Why is that? Is it because socialist policies aren't designed to help the poor, but are designed to help the rich? Is it, as I keep saying, because socialism is a lie that the elite know benefits themselves and have fooled people into believing it? Oh wait, yes it is. The billionaires own the government and the corporations and the central banks that Karl Marx called for in the Communist Manifesto. Strange that is, isn't it? Those capitalists and robber barons you talk about are actually socialists. If you want to continue calling them capitalists, by all means. But in that case, I'm not a capitalist. I'm a free market guy and am therefore against capitalism/socialism, end quote." So this is Tick response, right? So, and we have a lot of things to respond to, even with this short comment, right? And there's like so much nonsense in this comment. It's unbelievable, actually. Now, let us respond to his assertion that we have now more socialist policies than ever before in the West, right? And supposedly because of that, the rich keep getting richer because of these supposed socialist policies, right? Okay, let us look into that, right? So, here's the Independence saying, businesses and wealthy people handed 36 billion pound tax cuts under Rishi Sunak. So, right off the bat, would you say that this is a socialist policy, Tik? Tax cuts for the rich? So, yeah, let us show you another example, right? Germany's privatization of state assets, winners and losers. India is in the process of privatizing large state-owned companies, and many people are wondering what advantages and disadvantages this will bring. A look at Germany reveals who the winners and losers could be. Germany can look back on more than 6 decades of experience in the privatization of state-owned companies. As early as the 1960s, huge corporations such as Volkswagen or the mining and electricity company Verba went partially into the hands of private shareholders. So decades of privatization, right? So, yeah. And here's a quote. This wave of privatization in the 1960s was essentially driven by the idea that parts of state-owned companies be sold to the general public across the board, explained the social scientist, who in a 2019 book examined the history of privatization in Germany and Europe. Now, decades of privatization in Germany, right? Now let's look at some effects of that, right? Some winners, some losers. The experiences with the privatization of state-owned companies in Germany are varied, especially when it comes to winners and losers. As for losers, above all, many employees have been on the wrong side in the privatizations of the past 20 to 30 years, Sachs said. Those who were previously employed in state-owned companies are the losers in this process. Efficiency gains quite often led to payoffs and a reduction in employment in the medium term. So yeah, would you say that this is a socialist policy Tik? Privatization of state-owned companies. Now let's look at another example here. Again, Germany as an example. How good is Germany to its super rich? So, Germany just got a new billionaire, financier and TV celebrity Carsten Marschmeyer landed on Forbes billionaire list. The ranks of millionaires and billionaires in Germany have been indeed swelling in recent years. The German Federal Statistical Office announced this week that the number of German taxpayers with an annual income over 1 million euro rose by 1,900 to 24,700, citing the most recent figures from 2017. Okay, so billionaires, right, in Germany. And let's look at some things concerning that. Stefan Bach, a public economics research associate at the German Institute for Economic Research, pointed out that the highest earners can often skirt income taxes. Quote, the super rich, the giant incomes, the businesses, the Klatten, Quandt and Oetker families and so on, the family businesses, they aren't even included because their income is largely separated into business structures and therefore is not subject to the progressive income tax, he told Deutsche Welle. So the super rich are not even subject to the progressive income tax in Germany. Isn't that interesting? Would you say that this is a socialist policy take? Now let's look at another example. NHS privatization drive linked to rise in avoidable deaths study suggests. The privatization of NHS care accelerated by Tory policies a decade ago has corresponded with a decline in quality and, quote, significantly increased rates of death from treatable causes, the first study of its kind says. So privatization of NHS accelerated by Tory policies. Would you say that this is a socialist policy take? Would you say that the West has socialist policies when you see such headlines? Now let's look at another example. Explaining the erosion of private sector unions, how corporate practices and legal changes have undercut the ability of workers to organize and bargain. Right, this is from the Economic Policy Institute. Labor law has not kept pace with workers' interests and needs and provides a classic example of policy drift. The failure to update the law to reflect changing external circumstances, with the result that and the outcomes of the policies start to shift. Labor law's support for workers' ability to pursue union organizing and collective bargaining has declined over many decades, and efforts to remedy this drift have been blocked by a minority of senators despite majority support in both houses of Congress and presidential support for reform. So our political system, dominated by a minority of senators, is able to block the strengthening of unions, right? And unions are a socialist institution, right? Giving the workers bargaining power, right? To challenge the class interests, right? And the class power of the capitalist class, right? So would you say that this is a socialist policy? Does this reflect an increase in socialist policies in the West? Take another example, right? Let's look at Joe Biden, right? Because even though there are some progressive economic policies here and there by Joe Biden, he's definitely more economically left-wing than Trump, right? But still not a socialist by a long shot, right? But many Republicans and right-wingers claim that he's some kind of socialist. Now there's an article by Ben Burgess, says, I'm a socialist, Joe Biden is not. When Biden was in the Senate, he earned the nickname the Senator from MBNA for his chummy relationship with the MBNA holding company, parent company of MBNA Bank. According to Jacobin staff writer Branko Marcitic, author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden, Biden voted against a measure requiring credit card companies to warn consumers of the consequences of making only minimum payments, and voted 4 times for an industry-supported bankruptcy bill that made it harder for financially strained borrowers to get protections from creditors. Now he did something on behalf of industry, as it says here, right? And he had even ties to holding companies, so there you can see the bourgeoisie infiltrating politics right there. Now, let's get to some other policies, right? That are more recent, right? The Inflation Reduction Act included some much needed climate spending, but also plenty of corporate-friendly deregulation, and his student debt relief measure were a welcome break from his past policies. As a senator, he helped make it impossible for student loan borrowers to declare bankruptcy, was still miserly and means-tested. Socialists advocate treating higher education just like K-12 education as a universal social right, something that everyone should have the option to pursue if they choose to. We want tuition-free public education at every level, from preschool to graduate schools, so of course we think it's outrageous that people are shaken down decades after graduating for something they never should have been charged for in the first place. So, would you say that we live in a socialist economy when in America the education is heavily charged, right, and not a universal right, right? No free education. Isn't that interesting, right? Would you say that this is socialist policy in the West, right? Now, here's another Biden example. Wealthy Americans may get a tax cut 10 times bigger than a middle-class family in the Biden social spending bill, right? Again, tax cuts for the rich. So, yeah, socialist policy, right? So, and here's also an article. Neoliberal policies have led to inequality, IMF, right? Instead of delivering growth, some neoliberal policies have increased inequalities and have not delivered as expected, according to a recent report from the International Monetary Fund. So even the imperialist IMF admits that neoliberal policies have actually increased inequality. Neoliberalism, a policy model that advocates the control of economic factors to the private sector from the public sector, has been a dominant ideology since the 1980s. It rests on two main planks. Firstly, by increased competition that is achieved through deregulation and the opening up of domestic markets, and secondly, through privatization and limits on the ability of government to run fiscal deficits and accumulate debt. The paper dated June 2016 explained. While the paper authored by Jonathan Ostry, the deputy director of the IMF's research department, Prakash Longani, its division chief, and David Forseri, an economist applauds the neoliberal agenda for a number of things. It also outlines two aspects of the neoliberal agenda that have failed to deliver. These include capital account liberalization, also known as removing restrictions on the movement of capital across borders, and fiscal consolidation, sometimes referred to as austerity. Now, would you say that those policies like austerity are socialist policies, Tick? Would you say that? So, and also when it comes to foreign policy, right, let us look at some foreign policy, whether or not this is actually socialist, what we have right now, right? Best example, the Ukraine war, right? Now, this is from Multipolarista, a great article here. Zelensky is literally selling Ukraine to US corporations on Wall Street. Ukraine's Western-backed leader Volodymyr Zelensky opened the New York Stock Exchange, telling Wall Street his country is open for foreign corporations to exploit it with $400 billion in state sell-offs. Ukraine's Western-backed leader Volodymyr Zelensky virtually opened the New York Stock Exchange on the morning of September 6th, symbolically ringing the bell via video stream. Zelensky announced that his country is open for business, that is to say that foreign corporations are free to come and exploit its plentiful resources and low-paid labor. In a speech launching the neoliberal sell-off program Advantage Ukraine, Zelensky offered Wall Street a chance for you to invest now in projects worth of hundreds of billions of dollars. The financial news service Business Wire published a press release from the Ukrainian government in which Zelensky boasted the 400 plus billion dollars in investment options featured on AdvantageUkraine.com span public-private partnerships, privatization, private ventures, a USAID-supported project team of investment bankers and researchers appointed by Ukraine's Ministry of Economy will work with businesses interested in investing. So, privatization, public-private partnerships, and private ventures. Would you say that those are socialist policies? Take? And by the way, Zelensky also banned communist opposition parties, right? Would you say that this is a socialist policy? You know, I'm just asking, right? So, and also when it comes to this war, right? Weapons makers profit handsomely off the Ukraine war. 3 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, the winners and losers are apparent. The losers are civilians in Ukraine and soldiers on both sides of the conflict, while the winners are weapons manufacturers like BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon Technologies, and Rheinmetall. So, would you say that this is socialist when weapons manufacturers, US weapons manufacturers, are profiting from the Ukraine war because the Western governments are all pouring, especially the United States is pouring weapons in Ukraine, arming Nazis, right? Arming Ukrainian Nazis. Would you say that this is a socialist policy? And there's even a study suggesting that arming Ukraine would prolong the conflict, right? So, and again, Western governments are enriching these weapon contractors, right? Would you say that this is a socialist policy? These weapon contractors that arm the neo-Nazis of Ukraine to fight against Russia are profiting from the war, and our governments are supporting that. Would you say that this is a socialist policy? Tick. Now, here's also another aspect to this, right? Landlordism, right? And how land ownership is driving inequality, right? Because this is a question what actually drives this dynamic of the rich getting richer, right? And according to Tick, it is socialism, right? Now let us look at this paper. Landlord elites on the Dutch housing market, private landlordism, class and social inequality. The past decade has seen a revival of private renting across a wide range of countries and housing regimes. Economic and housing reconstructing has enhanced rental housing's appeal as an investment class. Apart from an increase in investment from firms, institutions and trusts, this has triggered a revival of private landlordism among individuals and households. Yet few detailed studies on the social, demographic and economic profiles of landlords exists. To fill this gap and understand landlords' class position, this article draws on Dutch registered data with information on the entire Dutch population and housing stock. Analyses of their socioeconomic characteristics reveal the highly privileged class position of many landlords, with a substantial portion found in top income, wealth, and neighborhood positions. 1/3 of the top wealth percentile, the Dutch top 1%, consists of landlords, underscoring their vast economic power. Although landlords with larger housing portfolios are notably more affluent, small-scale landlords are also highly overrepresented in the upper economic strata. Fundamentally, this article's findings urge us to consider landlordism specifically and housing more broadly in terms of class formation and delineation, with a class of landlord elites mobilizing multiple properties for the purpose of wealth accumulation and class reproduction. So this highlights that land ownership is a means to get rich, right? And this is not by coincidence, not by accident, that the richest people are landlords, right? That have this class position, right? Here's another article highlighting this, right? Here's why the ultra wealthy like Bill Gates and Thomas Piketty are investing in US farmland. Private landowners are also making a profit by utilizing the land in numerous ways. Approximately 39% of the 911 million acres of farmland across the US is rented out to farmers, and 80% of that rented farmland is owned by landlords who don't farm themselves. Data from the agriculture department shows, right? So this is a private rentier class that is gaining power and wealth. across the world, as exemplified in the Netherlands and in the United States. Would you say that this is a sign that we live in a socialist economy, right? When this is happening. Here's another example. From England, half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. Research by author reveals corporations and aristocrats are the biggest landowners. So, and here's a graph showing this, right? So 30% of land ownership has largely unchanged for centuries among the aristocracy and gentry. And then 18% corporations and 17% oligarchs and city bankers own the land, while the public sector owns merely 8.5%. So this is interesting, isn't it, right? That the public sector, in contrast to private corporations and oligarchs and city bankers, doesn't own that much land, right? And again, land ownership is a means for profit and is a means for the accumulation of capital and a driver of economic inequality, right? And also because Tik likes to say that owning shares is like the public owning the means of production, right? And he says that 50% of Americans are invested in shares, right? But this doesn't really mean much if the wealthiest 10% of Americans own a record of 89% of all US stocks, right? So, yeah, this is, according to Tik, the sign of socialism, right? But is that really true? Would you really say that this is true? And here's a blog post on the blog The Next Recession by the economist Michael Roberts, called Inequality and Exploitation, right? And he writes, Simon Moon, Emeritus Professor of Economics, has published a paper that showed that Marx's class analysis, which rests on the ownership of the means of production between the owner of the means of production and who exploits those who own nothing but their labor power, remains broadly correct, even in modern capitalist economies like the US. He found that the working class, those who depend on wages alone for their living, still constitute 84% of the working population. Managers constitute the rest, but only 2% can actually live off rent, interest, capital gains, and dividends alone. They are the real capitalist class, and that ratio has little changed in 100 years. Moreover, this is the group that has gained most during the last 30 years of rising inequality. The income of this capitalist class has risen from about 9 times the average income of the working class to 22 times, while managers' incomes have risen from 2.5 times to 3.5 times workers' income. So rising inequality is primarily the result of increased exploitation, a rising rate of surplus value in Marxist terms. So this is an actual explanation of the rise in inequality, right? So, again, would you say that all these policies that I just showed, right? The tax cuts and the privatization, the rising in exploitation, right? Would you say that those, and the erosion of unions, and would you say that those are socialist policies, right? Tick, would you really say that those are the socialist policies that make the rich getting richer? Now, let's go on with his comment, right? So, he says that he admits that the billionaires own the government, so capitalist billionaires own the government, right? But according to him, those are socialists, but we will get to that. And he says the central banks that Karl Marx called for in the Communist Manifesto, right? So he says that the central banks are somehow socialist that we have right now, right? And he seems to be under the impression that the that Karl Marx somehow invented central banks or something. At least this is kind of the implication here, isn't it? Right? Or somehow popularized central banking, or like what does this even mean, right? Central banks were called for in the Communist Manifesto, right? And Tick wants to make the argument that since we now have central banks, that this is a sign of socialism because Karl Marx is a socialist and he called for central banks. Is that the argument, Tick? Okay, let us get to that, right? So this is part of the Communist Manifesto, right? And he has outlined like general proposals, right? That the working class in that time frame, in that revolutionary context, right, should pursue, right? So, for example, like the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, right? Which is, by the way, a complete contradiction of the private landlordism that I have shown before, right? So, but yeah. So, and his fifth proposal says centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So this is basically where Karl Marx calls for central banking, right? Now the Communist Manifesto is published, or was published in 1848, right, in London. But let's actually look at the history, right, of central banking, right? Because it appears to me that central banking is a little bit older than Karl Marx. The use of money as a unit of account predates history. Government control of money is documented in the ancient Egypt economy, 2750 to 2150 BCE. Now, would you say that ancient Egypt was a socialist economy, Tick? Would you say that ancient Egypt had socialism because government control of money was apparent in ancient Egypt? Would you say that ancient Egypt was a socialist economy? Now, also in the medieval and the early modern period, a network of professional banks was established in Southern and Central Europe. The institutes built a new tier in the financial economy. The monetary system was still controlled by government institutions, mainly through the coinage prerogative. Now, monetary system controlled by government institutions in medieval Europe. Would you say that medieval Europe therefore was socialism? Even though banks, however, could use book money to create deposits for their customers, thus they had the possibility to issue, lend, and transfer money autonomously without direct government control. Would you say medieval Europe had socialism already? Now, of course, there's also the Bank of England, right, which was established in 1694, right? Would you say that we already had socialism in England since 1694, right? So yeah, Tick, this is kind of contradicting what you try to imply here, that Karl Marx sort of came up with central banking or something, right? Even though we actually have government control and central banking way earlier, before Marx was even born. Now, what actually socialist type of nationalization of banking means, right, can be seen in the example of the Gosbank, right, of the Soviet Union. Now, let me show you what this would actually mean in the socialist sense, right? So the Soviet state used Gosbank primarily as a tool to impose centralized control upon industry in general, using bank balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity of individual concerns and their compliance with 5-year plans and directives. Gosbank did not act as a commercial bank in regard to the profit motive. It acted theoretically as an instrument of government policy. Instead of independently and impartially assessing the creditworthiness of the borrower, Gosbank would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. So in other words, this Gosbank was basically a tool for the central planning of the economy, right? Not for private profit, but for the society as a whole, for the benefit of the society as a whole, right? As conceived by the Soviet Union, right? So to advance the industrialization, for example, and things like that, right? So let's contrast that to central banking in capitalism, right? So here's a paper titled Central Banking in Contemporary Capitalism, Monetary Policy and Its Limits. And it says in the abstract, central banks have used their power to protect financial profits while socializing financial losses at the expense of the vast majority of society. Now, protecting private profits, right? Now let's look at how this might be true, right? So here's an article by International Socialist Review titled Rescuing Capitalism, the Role of the Federal Reserve System. The structure of the Fed indicates its primary constituency. The commercial banks it theoretically regulates. As the servant to Wall Street, the Fed must maintain a stable financial system of profit-seeking institutions duty-bound to serve their shareholders. After repeated deregulation, particularly by Democratic presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton in 1980 and 1999, these banks have become gigantic complex financial institutions that provide a wide variety of financial services, from insurance to financial management to insurance of securities, stock, bonds, and complex financial instruments. The Fed proudly describes its status as independent within government. Quote, as the nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve derives its authority from the US Congress. It is considered an independent central bank because its decisions do not have to be ratified by the president or anyone else in the executive or legislative branch of government. It funds itself through fees for its services, and the terms of the members of the Board of Governors span multiple presidential and congressional terms. The only oversight requirement is for the chairman of the Fed to report to Congress twice a year. Its structure alone disproves the American myth of the government by representative democratic institutions. The Fed's unique status makes it potentially an even better servant for the overall maintenance of capitalism than representative government. In its private deliberations, the Fed literally serves as a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, by the way Marx and Engels characterized the executive of the modern state. Serving the interest of the entire ruling class in practice means maintaining financial institutions and capital because they are fundamental to the functioning of capitalism. So there you go. The Federal Reserve is independent, and its decisions don't even have to be ratified by the president or anyone else in the executive or legislative branch of government. Contrast that with the socialist Gosbank, which was entirely controlled by the government and which was not about protecting the private profits of the capitalist class, right? So, and here you can also see how central banks' interest rate rises affect the richest and poorest families, right? Received wisdom has it that low interest rates boost economic growth, spreading wealth across society. But Professor Jose Luis Pedro and his colleagues have been able to reveal the truth. Rising prices threaten to hit the poorest hardest, but at the same time, higher interest rates can hit families with mortgages and consumer loans. We found a 1 percentage point drop in interest rates boosted the incomes of the top earners by 5% over 2 years, while the lowest earners saw only 0.5% rise. Lower interest rates have larger impact upon the value of assets than they do upon disposable income, and the wealthier have more financial and real assets. So, as you can see, these central banks are benefiting mainly the rich and the capitalist class, right? Meanwhile, they do not benefit the poor so much and the working class, right? So you can see that the central banks are acting on behalf of the capitalist class, and the governments are acting on behalf of the capitalist class, right? You can also see it here. Soaring markets helped the richest 1% gain $6.5 trillion in wealth last year. According to the Fed, the wealth of the top percent increased by $6.5 trillion last year, mainly driven by soaring stock prices and financial markets. According to the Federal Reserve, the stock portfolios of the top 1% are now worth $23 trillion, and they own a record 53.9% of individually held shares. Right, so this is in stark contrast what Tick is talking about, right? So like I said before, central banks have existed even before Karl Marx was even born, and they have protected private profits in contrast to central banking in like the USSR, which acted on behalf of the 5-year plans, right? And was fully controlled by the government. So, and now let's look at the last part of his comment, right? He says those capitalists and robber barons you talk about are actually socialists. I mean, I had to really laugh at this point, right? So the robber barons are actually socialists. Okay, let us look at some examples of these robber barons, right? So here's a list of businessmen labeled as robber barons. So let us look at some of these people, right? So Andrew Carnegie, American industrialist, became one of the richest people in history. Okay, according to Tick, he was a socialist. Jeff Bezos, okay, according to Tick, he is a socialist. Okay, very interesting. Who else? J.P. Morgan, American financier and investment banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street throughout the Gilded Age. Yeah, a big socialist, right? Elon Musk, business magnate and investor, CEO and chief engineer of SpaceX, CEO and product architect of Tesla, big socialist, right? John D. Rockefeller, again, American business magnate and philanthropist. He was widely considered as one of the wealthiest of Americans of all time. So, yeah, great socialist, right? Okay, yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, of course, internet entrepreneur. So, yeah, according to Tick, these people are all socialists. Isn't that interesting, right? They own these huge private companies, and they have wage labor, right? They employ workers to produce their profits, right? But according to Tick, they're all socialists, right? These people like Jeff Bezos, he has like bought a yacht within a yacht, right? Meanwhile, his workers are living paycheck to paycheck, and some of them live even on food stamps. But Jeff Bezos is a socialist, according to Tick. Okay. So yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? So now he says, if we continue to call these people that I just mentioned, these robber barons, right? If we want to call them capitalists, then in that case, Tick no longer calls himself capitalist. So that really actually reveals Tick's motivations, right? He doesn't want capitalism to be criticized. So everything, the negative things that capitalism produces, he just calls that socialist. Isn't that interesting? So he calls himself, I'm a free market guy. So again, this whole free market meme is complete bullshit. The free market has never existed. It is anti-historical. It has nothing to do with reality, right? It is a Platonic idea. It is idealism. It never existed in reality, right? And it never can exist in reality because the free market needs a state backing the private property of the capitalist class, right? If there was no government, right, and you had only a free market, guess what would happen? The workers would just take over the means of production, right? Because why would they tolerate just rich capitalists profiteering of the work of the workers, right? Why would the workers tolerate that? They wouldn't, right? So it needs a state backing and protecting the capitalist class, right? And on the whole free markets thing, I can recommend you this video by the YouTube channel The Marxist Project. The video is titled Capitalist Mythology, Free Markets, the State and Primitive Accumulation. And this video explains that how like the Enclosure Acts, which were by the English government, privatized the commons, right? And threw the workers off their lands and into the cities to work for private capitalists in these factories, right? So you can see that the state acted on behalf of the capitalists, right? So yeah. So this is really all I want to show you, right? Tick has absolutely no clue of what he's talking about. He thinks that we live in a socialist economy, even though we live in a capitalist economy. Again, the means of productions are still held in private hands, right? There's still wage labor. There is still production for profit instead of need, right? Production is for need, right? For the benefit of the general society would be socialist, would be one characteristics of socialism, right? And yeah, this is not what we see today, isn't it? Tick, right? We see the working class being living in misery. Meanwhile, capitalist firms, especially big international corporations, making record profits, and the state giving them a free pass, right, and supporting that. Yeah, so this nonsense that Tick is talking about, I needed to make this debunking video because I think it is actually dangerous bullshit that Tick is pushing here, right? Basically wants to shield every flaw and every criticism of capitalism and just call it socialist, right? Right? And again, Tick, the government doing stuff is not socialist, okay? You can have a authoritarian government, right, that acts out state repression, and it still has a capitalist economy, right? We saw it with Pinochet in Chile, right? It was a dictatorship. It had much state repression. It persecuted communists, right? It killed a bunch of communists, right? But it was still a capitalist economy, right? It had these free market reforms by the Chicago Boys, and Pinochet was protecting the interests of the capitalist class, right? Just as one example, right? Or even like Margaret Thatcher, right? She was crushing the unions, right? That was state repression, right? That was authoritarian act by the state that Margaret Thatcher used. But that does not mean that she was a socialist, right? So just because a state acts authoritarian does not mean that it is socialist, right? So yeah, Tik. This, I hope you see this video and learn something from it, because it's actually kind of embarrassing what you show in some of these videos that have to do with economics, right? Because your other videos on history and military history are actually very competent, right? They're actually very good. But as soon as you touch economics, it just falls apart. I'm sorry, because you have a very anti-historical and incorrect view of capitalism and socialism. You have a very idealistic view of capitalism and a very cartoonish view of socialism. So yeah, this is really all I wanted to say. Thanks for watching.